Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My name is Kusnan. On this occasion, I will present a paper that I wrote with my colleague Kalilurrahman entitled A Test of Resilience of Islamic Banks in Indonesia During the COVID-19 Pandemic. We are students of the Master of Science in Islamic Finance Study at Postgraduates and Professional Studies at the International Center for Education in Islamic Finance in Shape, Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. So our agenda today is, the first is introduction. We will explain the background, objectives, and problem of this research. And the second is methodology, where we will provide samples, indicators, and statistical methods. And the third part is the result and discussion. Then we close with conclusion and suggestion for policymakers. So as we all know that since the beginning of 2020, the world has been hit by the coronavirus and has quickly become a global pandemic. And the pandemic, of course, causes disruption that has an impact on various sectors that affect the lives of many people. One of the sectors affected is banking. Even though in some cases this sector has had experience in dealing with financial crisis, the crises caused by the pandemic are slightly different and have caused some disruption experienced by the banking sector, such as increase in non-performing loans or non-performing financing caused by the failure of the household sector and companies to manage their business. In line with that, credit absorption in the community may also face considerable obstacles. In the report of McKinsey Group, the banking industry will be facing two problems in the future in connection with the crisis due to this pandemic. The first will face several credit failures, and the second will face a profound challenge to ongoing operation that may persist beyond 2024. Indonesia itself cannot be separated from the impact caused by this pandemic. At the macroeconomic level, data such as Indonesia's economic growth rate in the second quarter of 2020 has decreased by 5.32%. Overall, in 2020, the Indonesian economic will decline to 2.07%. Small medium enterprise is the most sector impacted by COVID-19 pandemic. As a country with the largest Muslim population globally and the largest market for Sharia products, it cannot be separated from Sharia banking, which has experienced significant growth in Indonesia. Currently, there are no less than 14 Sharia commercial banks and 20 Sharia business units operating and having branch in Indonesia. Meanwhile, according to data from Indonesia Financial Services Authority or OJK, Indonesian Sharia banking is still experiencing finance problem on the NPF indicator. Therefore, in terms of the COVID pandemic crisis, it is interesting to observe whether the financial condition of Sharia banking in Indonesia is able to withstand the macro financial condition that existed during the pandemic. We call this as a resiliency. The resiliency of banks, which is mean in this paper, is the ability of banks to keep enough capital and reserve in advocating the risk which can come from their business operations so that banks can operate safely. Furthermore, testing resiliency tests whether Bank Syariah in Indonesia can survive amid the COVID-19 pandemic and run its business well, as evidenced by its internal indicators. Secondly, macro conditions are the leading indicators of a country affected by the economic crisis due to the COVID-19 pandemic. This affects the financial performance indicator of Islamic banking in Indonesia. This paper tries to answer these problems. So this study will take a sample of 10 Islamic commercial banks in Indonesia and 10 Islamic business units and rural banks that operate in Sharia. The data used is secondary data from annual reports released in December 2020. A test of resilience includes analysis of the bank's financial condition and analysis of the bank's external condition. Analysis of financial condition includes capital condition, share equity, and non-performance financing. Then a regression test will be conducted to determine whether there is any influence between Indonesian macroeconomic indicators and this financial condition. And then to test the differences in the financial performance of Islamic banks in the pre and during the COVID-19 pandemic in Indonesia, an independent sample t-test was used. Meanwhile, to examine the differences in financial performance, the study used a pair of sample t-test or dependence t-test. Parent t-test to find out are the difference in the financial indicators of Islamic commercial banks and Sharia business units before the pandemic, which is 2019, and during the COVID-19 pandemic, which is 2020, with the hypothesis that there are differences in the financial indicators between before and during the pandemic. If the hypothesis is accepted, it means that the COVID-19 pandemic will affect financial condition in 2020. To find out whether Islamic banks are affected or not by Indonesia macroeconomics condition during the COVID-19 pandemic, the study conducted a regression test between Indonesia macroeconomics indicator and financial indicator owned by Islamic banks that were the research sample. That the independent variable is macroeconomic indicators and the dependent variable is bank financial indicators. Hypothesis is HO, there is no impact of Indonesian macroeconomics condition with the financial condition of Islamic banks and Sharia business unit in Indonesia, which means that Islamic banks are not sufficiently resilient to the COVID-19 pandemic that hit in Indonesia in the first years of 2020. H1, there is an impact of Indonesian macroeconomic condition with the financial condition of Islamic banks and Sharia business units in Indonesia, which means that Islamic banks are quite resilient with the COVID-19 pandemic that hit in Indonesia in the first years 2020. And for regression result of Islamic banks, Islamic commercial banks, it can be seen that Indonesia macroeconomics condition affect the capital adequacy of Islamic banks in Indonesia in every quarter of 2020, meaning that in terms of CAR, Islamic banks in Indonesia are not resilient enough during the COVID-19 pandemic. In situations such as in this case, if there is no intervention from the government, the bank has the potential for quite significant losses in the long term. Meanwhile, in the terms of return on asset, the results are pretty interesting, showing no influence of macroeconomic condition on the bank's ability to generate net income from the utilization of assets owned by the banks. This Islamic bank during the pandemic still produced a reasonable good net profit. The application of a profit sharing system in financing is a sector that is quite influential in the bank's resilience to macroeconomic shock due to the pandemic. This is in line with the ability of Islamic banks to overcome the crisis that existed in Indonesia during 1998 and 2008. In terms of NPF or non-performing financing in quarter one, it was pretty resilient because COVID-19 in Indonesia was only announced at the end of quarter one. Then NPF continued to be affected in every quarter in line with shocks that occur on the macroeconomic side due to the COVID-19 mitigation policy carried out by the government. So for the result of Islamic unit and rural banks, for the Sharia unit as a whole, it looks more like it is not resilient enough to face shocks in the macroeconomic sector due to the COVID-19 pandemic. The regression results show that almost all indicators in each quarter reject the null hypothesis, which means there is an influence on the internal financial condition of the bank. Market share and small amount of capital are factors. Micro business units are not resilient enough. When a shock occurs, such as the current COVID-19 pandemic, management is more concerned with taking care of the parent bank. So, at the end of the day, this study ultimately concluded that overall, this COVID-19 pandemic causes shocks in the economic sector in Indonesia, both on micro and macro scale. However, amid the economic shocks, Islamic banks are still trying to survive and can generate profits for their stakeholders. If analyzed internally, Islamic banks, both commercial banks and Sharia business units in Indonesia, are still quite reasonable according to the standards set by Bank Indonesia. However, the NPF indicators need special attention in line with the pandemic condition that have not shown when it will be completed. Based on the result of the priority test with condition before the pandemic, namely in 2019, it was found that financial conditions shown by CAR, ROA, and NPF before the pandemic were not closely related to the financial condition that occurred during the pandemic 2020. Regression between Indonesia macroeconomic independent variables which are in shock with the pandemic COVID-19, the CAR and VF in commercial banks are not sufficiently resilient or affected by the existing shocks. However, ROA shows a resiliency condition. This means that overall, this pandemic affects the resiliency of Islamic banks in Indonesia. In the long term, of this pandemic continue and there is no government intervention on Indonesia macroeconomic condition, it can be said that Islamic bank in Indonesia will also be effective. And therefore, we advise policymakers to, the first is government should pay attention to the condition of Islamic banks in Indonesia. And the first is starting to rationalize the number of existing banks. The government moved to merge 3 Islamic banks in early 2021 into Bank Syariah Indonesia. Is an excellent step to get through the crisis and face similar crisis in the future. Maybe it can be followed by a merger of privately owned Islamic banks in Indonesia. The third, macroeconomic stimulus is very much needed because Indonesia's current macroeconomic condition hurt the financial performance of existing Islamic banks. The fourth, micro stimulus on the bank side is also needed. Financing relaxation is needed to reduce NPF so that Islamic banks are more resistant to macroeconomic shocks. And the last is fund injection are also needed so that Islamic banks can channel financing to the small medium enterprise sector, which can also improve Indonesia macroeconomic indicators. That's all our presentation today. Thank you for the attention. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.